to our webinar today on what's my fuel health score. And this is only going to be about 30 minutes. Typically we do an hour, but this is a shorter one. And I am Eric Bjornstedt. I am the Technical Information Director here at Bell Performance. And we want to talk today about stored fuel. And the way that stored fuel has changed in the last 10 or 20 years, it's become more important than ever to maintain that fuel well. But the trouble is that there's just so much information out there on what you should be doing and what you shouldn't be doing. It can kind of get overwhelming. You know, the internet it's great. It's fundamentally changed both society and also the way everyone does business, to the point where we wouldn't dream of not being able to find out almost anything we think that we want to know. And we expect to have that information at our fingertips at a moment's notice. And in fact, it's gotten to the point where we sometimes feel almost aggrieved if we have to wait more than like 3 seconds for a particular web page to load. So what happens when we get overloaded with all this information? I mean, have you ever gone into a restaurant and you begin a menu that looks like a doctoral dissertation of food choices? I mean, I remember my wife and I going into Cheesecake Factory, and they hand you this menu and you're just swamped with all these choices, not even counting, the 40 different kinds of cheesecake they have. And marketing professionals actually in the restaurant industry are coming around to the idea that, maybe having a menu that weighs 12 pounds may actually hurt their their food sales, because it gets to the point where it makes it more difficult for people to make decisions. And that is what the research shows in all areas across the spectrum. The more information choices you have, even if it happens to be the right information, the more difficult it becomes to make decisions, whether it's picking something from the menu at a restaurant or trying to settle on the right solution to some kind of problem in some fuel that you might be managing. So it's not always the best thing to be overloaded with information, and that's even if the information that you got happens to actually be the right information, because there's a lot of bad information out there. And if you're not a fuel expert, then it can be difficult to tell what's accurate, what's good information versus what's not. And so that is where we come in here at Bell Performance. We've always tried to connect people with the right information to help them with whatever their problems are. And sometimes people need someone to help them guide them through, what I call guide them through the noise, to the point where they can find what they need to make the right decisions for them and whatever problem that they're facing in stored fuel. And speaking of that fuel, stored fuel today has more problems than ever before. And what's more, think about the number of fuel storage tanks that there are. There's hundreds of thousands of fuel storage tanks all across the country. And one thing that's common to a great majority of them is the stored fuel contained inside is out of sight, out of mind. It's in there, but you never know exactly what's going on with it because it is out of sight, right? So it's nearly impossible to know the fuel's true condition unless you happen to be one of the few that does follow certain best practices like, rigorous condition monitoring of that fuel. So what we're going to do today is we are going to talk about an online tool that's been developed called the Fuel Pulse Health Check Tool, or Fuel Health Check Tool. Sometimes it's referred to by that name. And it's an online tool that asks a series of questions that touch on things that are known, relevant characteristics and influences on stored fuel health and storage tank health. Then it takes whatever answers you give and it boils them down into a projection of what the health of that stored fuel might be. So this is the Fuel Pulse Health Check Tool. So in our time together today in this webinar, we're going to run through the online tool. We're going to talk about the questions that it asks, of which there are 12. We're going to discuss why the questions matter when it comes to predicting or assessing the health of stored fuel and storage tanks, and also what the significance of some of the answer choices might be. Why are we asking these kind of questions? And then at the end, we'll talk about the results that you're going to get, what those results mean, because you have to know what this kind of thing means or else it's not useful, and some options on how the information can be delivered to you. So let's start at the beginning, the online tool. Now, it is located at, there's a landing page, bellperformance.com/fuelcheck. Now, when you go to that, this is what you see. This is the front page. And to start with, you see this front page, and it has this introduction here. The introduction says, if your question is, will your stored fuel be ready when you need it? That's what this fuel health check tool aims to give you a better idea on. Now, as you go through the tools, you're going to answer a series of multiple choice questions on what you know about both your fuel and your storage tanks. And then at the end, the tool is going to give you a score, and that reflects a projection of the health of your stored fuel and storage tank. Now, these questions, they all have to do with things concerning whether you know if your fuel has changed condition for the worse, and the things that you are or are not doing to help prevent this. Of course, not all factors in this sphere, impact stored fuel condition in the same way. So different answers, depending on what they are, they're weighted differently and they're given scores. And then those scores are aggregated internally so that when you complete the tool at the end, you're going to get this final score that's going to tell you this is your fuel health score, and then it'll give you an interpretation of whether that score implies that your stored fuel is okay, it's in good condition, or if there may be something that you might need to be concerned about. So let's run through this, see how it works. And so you would start by, of course, clicking the red start button, start here button, and you'll go to the first question. First question, have you pulled a fuel sample from your tanks in the last 2 months? And again, as you can see, the question's multiple choice, and you just select the choice that's most applicable to your situation with your fuel. Now, so this first question, this relates to stored fuel health because of the importance of monitoring your fuel's condition. If you're not pulling samples, if you're not checking on your fuel, at any kind of regular interval, that can be a problem because that makes it a lot less likely that you're going to see problems with your stored fuel, while they're happening or in the beginning before they become really serious problems. And so not checking your fuel is bad for your fuel's health. And this first question pins down whether you have pulled a sample and examined a sample of your fuel in the recent past. Of course, if you happen to find yourself, picking option number 4 here, how do I pull a fuel sample? Well, that also is a problem in and of itself. So once you've settled on a selection, you pick your choice, and it stays highlighted in red. The system records the answer internally, and then you're ready to click the arrow here to the next question. So we go to question number 2. Has your fuel's appearance or smell changed in the last few months? Now, I know I said that all these questions were multiple choice. Well, this, I think, actually is the only one that is what we would call a multi-option, which means you can actually choose multiple options here, right? So because more than one of these choices might apply to you. So you select all the options that apply to your situation. And the reason why this matters for stored fuel health is any change in the visual appearance or the smell of the fuel, those changes are known to be strong indicators that something is happening that has changed the condition of that fuel. So typically, when we're asking about a change in the fuel's appearance, we're assuming that appearance change is either that the fuel's gotten darker, like here, or that the fuel's gotten hazy or cloudy. Now, if the fuel's gotten darker, then that means that it's gone unstable. It's it's stratified. It's the heavy ends are coming out of solution, and that of course is not good for the condition of the fuel. If it's hazy or cloudy, we're talking about the presence of suspended or emulsified water. Now, if you have water in your fuel like this in this picture, in and of itself, that's not good to have emulsified water, but it can also be a sign of something more serious that may be happening in your fuel, like microbial contamination. Now, the reason why this could be a sign of microbial contamination is because microbes, during their biological life cycles, they produce things called biosurfactants, and they basically create emulsions, and then they use these emulsions to travel up into the fuel and consume elements of the fuel, for a food source. So if you have emulsified water, that doesn't prove in and of itself that you have a microbe problem, but it can be a supporting sign that there might be one in there. So to answer this question, you select all the options that apply for your situation. They apply to what you've noticed about the condition of your fuel. So here I've selected two options here, but the options stay, highlighted in red. So if your fuel's gotten darker than it used to be when you checked it, select that. If your fuel happens to be hazy when normally it's clear and bright like it's supposed to be, then you select that. If it's got a funny smell, you would select that, because fuel is supposed to smell, like fuel. It's supposed to have what we call a solvent smell. It's not supposed to smell like rotten eggs or something like that. So if that applies to you, you select that too. What if you don't really know because you haven't pulled any samples in, X number of months? Well, again, if you're not pulling samples and checking your fuel on a regular basis, then you're much less likely to be able to see problems when they're happening or before they turn into serious problems. And again, that's bad for your fuel's health. Okay, question number 3. Last time you did pull a fuel sample from the bottom of the tank, was there any solid material in the sample? So this seeks to identify specifically if you've noticed solid material. Now, what kind of solid material are we talking about here? When you pull, in a typical tank, when a bottom sample is pulled, and let's say you get, like in these, you get fuel phase, and you pull some water bottoms, and maybe you pull some of this stuff here, which is what we would call a rag layer. Well, what is this stuff? Well, this stuff is microbial biomass or biofilm. It's the biological material that microbes produce during their life cycles. And it can stick to internal, tank surfaces and components. And if the microbial infestation is high enough and they're producing enough of this kind of stuff, then it can get to the point where there's enough of it that when you pull a sample, it will break off and it will actually go into your sample, and then you can see that it's there. So if there's solid material contaminating your fuel sample, it's likely to be either microbial biomass. It's likely to have possibly some petroleum, tank sludge mixed in there. But there's also a chance that some of that solid material could be the result of storage tank damage. And now we're talking about a serious problem. Storage tank damage, we're talking about rust from corrosion damage. If it's serious enough, you can even get pieces of tank lining. If you've got a delamination problem, again, mostly caused by microbes, that can show up in there. So microbial activity in storage tanks has been known to be a key causal factor in both of these situations. So if your fuel sample ends up with remnants of this kind of stuff in it, that's an overt sign to you that not only do you need to be concerned about the health of your fuel, but now your storage tank might also be facing costly damage. So if you find yourself answering yes to this question, there's a sign something's going on you need to deal with. Now, one of these options here also talks about the issue of pulling a bottom sample versus pulling a middle sample. I think this one here. I'm not sure, as the last sample we pulled wasn't from the bottom of the tank. Now, best practices for condition monitoring of stored fuel always recommend pulling a bottom sample. Now, if that's not what you've been doing, let's say you've been pulling samples, but you've just been pulling them from the top, well, that can be a problem because those samples, if they're not bottom samples, they're not really going to be what we might say fully diagnostic. They don't give you a representative picture of what's really happening in your tank because many of the problems that stored fuel have or end up developing, they end up being concentrated at the bottom of the tank. The signs of them end up being concentrated at the bottom of the tank. And they may not show up in samples that have been taken from the middle or the top of the stored fuel. Question 4, have you noticed any change in the recent performance of any engines or equipment that are using your fuel? So the first 3 questions in the tool established whether you've noticed changes in the fuel's condition. Fourth question, we're moving to consider perceived changes in how your fuel's affecting what you use it in. Now, fuel that's in good condition, fuel that's clean, it's bright, it's in spec, fuel that's working like it's supposed to, that fuel's going to make your equipment and your engines, it's going to make them continue to run like they should. But when the fuel's condition changes, for example, if it becomes unstable, it starts to darken, it starts to, drop some of its heavy end components out of solution, well, that kind of fuel may not burn cleanly in the engine. And you see it manifested in problems like you get an increase in black smoke particulate produced by the engine, or maybe you see a change in your DPF filter regen cycles because you're getting more half-burned carbon ending up in that filter. Or maybe if you have stored diesel fuel and you have a microbial problem that's developed, that can affect fuel because microbial problems can degrade the fuel's cetane value because the microbes consume certain elements of the fuel that may be some of the, let's say, higher cetane elements of the fuel. They consume those for food, and the overall cetane value of that diesel fuel drops. And if it drops enough, you'll notice a change in how the engine is performing. It's not performing like it typically does. So even if you didn't know that you had a microbe problem, or even if you didn't know that your fuel was unstable, you would see those effects change in the way the engines perform when using the fuel. You would notice that. Okay, question 5. Are you required by any regulations that you know of to sample or test your fuel at any given intervals? So this question establishes if you're operating under any requirements that dictate having to do, specific sampling or testing of your stored fuel. So in this context, when we're talking about these kind of regulations, the presence of these kind of regulations may make it more likely that you keep proper tabs on the condition of your fuel, which means they make it more likely that you will notice problematic changes at an earlier time. So in that sense, regulatory requirements are good for stored fuel health because they require you to pay more attention to it. And this is especially true if you're in a certain business sector that requires not just sampling but also testing, like the healthcare sector. These regulations will force you to do best practice things that make ignoring your fuel not an option, right? They have to do this because the fuel in those areas, it's what we call mission critical. It has a mission critical function, like it's the emergency backup fuel for a hospital. Well, that's pretty important, and it's too important to leave its condition, the optional chance. Of course, having said all that, we have to point out that just because there's regulations in place and just because you may be following them, that doesn't in and of itself put you in the clear for fuel problems. It just means that you're required to pay closer attention to the fuel and you're more likely to detect fuel problems versus somebody who isn't bound by these regulations. But there may be some other best practices in your situation that you would want to follow as well, like with respect to what to do about those problems once you've noticed them. So presence of regulations is good, but doesn't necessarily just guarantee in itself that you're not going to have problems. Question number 6 is about the halfway point here. Question 6 has you self-identify if if your fuel is considered to be high turn or low turn. How long does your fuel sit in the storage tank before it's used up? Is it just a matter of days or like a week and then it's used up and you put more in? Or does your particular storage tank only get refilled a handful of times a year? What's the definition of high turn versus low turn? Well, there's no stock definition of those terms, so it's something that it requires a little bit of judgment on how you define what you have. Generally speaking, retail and fleet locations where the fuel's drawn from the tank on a daily basis or a semi-daily basis, that's considered to be high turn fuel. But if you have places that store fuel just for periodic use or emergency use, well, that would be considered to be low turn fuel. So really a good rule of thumb here is if your fuel sits in your tank for more than 6 months without getting used up, you would consider it low turn fuel. And you can probably guess why all this is relevant, right? The longer that the fuel sits in storage, the greater the chance of any number of kinds of problems or conditions developing that can degrade the fuel's condition. You might have a greater chance of microbial contamination. You might have a greater chance of excess free water developing. You might have more time for oxidation reactions to more fully develop in the fuel, which leads to darkening and stratification. Of course, that doesn't mean, if you have high turn fuel, that doesn't mean that it puts you free and clear from problems like microbial contamination. Contrary to what people might think, high turn fuel can develop its own fair share of problems, especially when you factor in that having problems develop isn't just about the condition of the fuel, it's also about the condition of the storage tank as well. And in a high-turn fuel storage tank, samples taken from the fuel at any given point in time might in themselves look okay, while there might be plenty of problems brewing in the storage tank itself. So, speaking in generalities, high-turn fuel is less prone to certain types of degradation problems that might be more commonly seen in low-turn fuel that sits in storage tanks for longer periods of time. But what's happening in their storage tanks might be a little bit of a different situation here. All right, so the next question number 7. Does your stored diesel fuel have significant biodiesel content? Now, there's a lot more biodiesel in our nation's fuel supply than there was 10 years ago. And whether you love it or hate it, that is just the way it is. Now, biodiesel has some good aspects to it that a lot of people like. But the fact of the matter is that it does not do as well in storage as conventional petrodiesel does. And it's more prone to developing fuel health problems. And so, as you would expect, all of the things being equal, the higher percentage of biodiesel you have in your fuel, the greater the chance of problems developing. So, to answer this question, we've got some choices here. You would choose between, yes, I have B20 or higher, or no, my fuel is 5% or less biodiesel, or I don't know. I don't know how much biodiesel content I've got. Now, really, after we put this together, we looked at this question and we said, well, really, this option, the 5% or less option, we probably should have worded it to cover everything below B20. Yes, my fuel is B20 or higher, or my fuel, I have biodiesel, but it's lower than B20. Biodiesel concentrations that are 20% or higher are much more prone to storage problems like instability, emulsification of water because biodiesel is hygroscopic, and very importantly, they are more prone to developing microbial contamination because microbes do love to feast on biodiesel. Now, if you have bio but it's below 20%, then as again, speaking in generalities, you probably don't have anything more to worry about with your fuel health score than if you think that you're running conventional diesel. In other words, there's not a significant difference. Now, keep in mind, though, that when we say conventional diesel, we are actually talking about 2 to 5% biodiesel anyway, because virtually all on-road diesel fuel has some amount of biodiesel in it, up to about 5%. And now, it used to be true that, yes, that's true for on-road, but off-road still, pure petrodiesel, not anymore. The exception for off-road fuel has been phased out in recent years. So even off-road diesel fuel that you get now is at the same risk for problems in this regard as on-road fuel. Now, this last choice, I don't know, and why does it matter? We put together this tool and put that kind of option on a few of the questions. And we put this in because not knowing why something is important makes it more likely that you're going to be affected by whatever problem may be associated with that issue. Because, think about it. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what to look for if there's a certain problem that might develop. So ignorance in these kind of cases really can hurt you and your fuel. Okay, question number 8. Have you added any kind of fuel additive or fuel treatment chemicals to your stored fuel in the last, say, 6 months or so? So this question speaks to the same conceptual thing that several of the previous questions did. How closely are you monitoring your fuel's condition? Now, if you have treated your fuel with some kind of additive in the last 6 months, irrespective of what additive you put in, of which there are many, irrespective of that, just the simple fact that you did that makes it more likely that you are paying closer attention to the condition of your fuel, at least enough to do the work of pulling samples and looking at them, right? And so awareness in this case really does increase the chances of good fuel health. Now, of course, having said that, it does matter what you've treated your fuel with. But in the interest of keeping things simple here, we can't account for every possible kind of fuel additive and whether, which ones are good, which ones are bad, etc. So this is somewhat of a generalization here. So this question 8 is really more about confirming how closely you're paying attention to your stored fuel's condition, which really is the first step to keeping that fuel healthy and in good condition. Question number 9, regarding your tank filters, has the frequency with which you're changing those filters, has that changed recently? So those of us who've been in the industry long enough can probably see where we're going with this. One tried and true sign that something's going on in the storage tank is a change in the frequency with which you change your filters. If something's going on in the storage tank, then it's probably going to be increasing the amount of filterable particulates that end up in the fuel, whether you're talking about microbial biomass, whether you're talking about tank sludge, asphaltene dropout, any of that kind of stuff. So if you start noticing the need to change your filters at a faster rate than what's normally established for your system, then that is a good bet that the health of your stored fuel is not what you'd ideally like it to be. Question 10. The last time you examined your tank filters, did you find dark slime or other kind of material in the filter? I mean, it's one thing to have to change your filters more often than usual, but it's another thing, it's a different thing to find any kind of dark, slimy material and ending up in the filter itself. Both of these phenomena, the rate at which you change your filters and what's ending up in your filters, both of those can be strong signs that something's going on in your tank that shouldn't be there. Now, generally speaking,
you should not be getting dark, slimy material showing up in your filters. That's not the kind of material that's normally produced by diesel fuel. Even diesel fuel going unstable, it's typically not associated with that. So this the sliminess is the key. The sliminess is usually a sign that at least part of the material is some kind of biofilm or microbial biomass. And if you have that in your filters, then that's a really strong indicator that there's microbial presence in the tank that you don't want to, you don't want that to be there. Now, sliminess is the key here because microbial biomass, contrary to popular opinion, microbial biomass is not always dark in and of itself. Um, so you might notice there's a light colored or even a clear material in the filter, but happens to be slimy. Well, that's still biofilm, so it's still a telltale sign of microbial presence. So if it's not always dark, what does the darkness have to do with it? Well, if the material is dark, what that darkness is coming, that coloration is coming from, is the biofilm being colored by asphaltene dropout or some kind of heavy end dropout from the fuel. And that means you've got not just one problem, but at least two problems now going on in there. So, if you have any kind of slimy material in your filters, but especially if it's dark slimy material, then that's a good sign something's going on in your tank and your fuel that's not going to be good for your fuel's health. And then of course there's a third option in the question. You can't remember the last time you looked inside a filter. I'm not sure. We haven't looked inside one of them. Strictly speaking, not remembering the last time you cracked open a filter isn't as bad as finding for sure dark material in that filter. But not remembering, it speaks to the problem again of not paying close enough attention to the fuel, and speaks to how that kind of inattentiveness can hinder you from detecting and addressing potential problems in as timely a manner as is optimally necessary. Okay, next to last question. Question number 11, talking about water. How much water was in your storage tank last time you checked? Free water monitoring for storage tanks. I think most of us, if not all of us, know this. Free water monitoring is essential to any and all sound fuel maintenance. So if you're not sure how much water's in there, or maybe you're one of the few that you don't know how to check for water, well, that's a big problem, in and of itself right there. Now, if you do have a measurement from last time, what's a good measurement? What's a bad one, right? Used to be way back in the day that you were allowed a certain amount of water. No, if it's below half an inch or quarter inch or whatever, then you don't need to worry about it. But of course, because of the microbial problems today, they're really moving away from that to try and say any detectable water is a problem. So, what's the minimum amount of water that you typically can detect? Well, for many tanks, that cutoff, that demarcation is about a quarter of an inch or so. But having any amount of water that's measurable, having any amount of water increases the chances of microbial fuel health problems. And the reason this is because microbes need very little water to do what they need to do, because it's a question of scale. Even if you had as little as an eighth of an inch or even like 2 millimeters of water, not even enough to measure, just 2 millimeters of water, if you're talking about from a size standpoint, to a microbe, if you put a microbe at the bottom of this 2 millimeter tiny little film of water, scale-wise, that is equivalent to a human being standing at the foot of Mount Everest and looking up at it. So even 2 millimeters of water is plenty enough water for a problematic amount of microbes to develop in your tank. And then the final question number 12. Have you had your tank or fuel serviced in the last 6 months? By service, we're talking about something like Have you done fuel polishing? Or even just something like fuel testing or tank cleaning, anything like that? Have you had that done in the last 6 months? So up to this point, all the questions have been about things that you may have noticed about your fuel's condition, whether the fuel's condition has changed, how it's changed, and also whether you've done certain things that are usually associated with good fuel maintenance, like monitoring the fuel's condition, checking for water content, looking at your filters. So this question ties things up by asking about what kind of recent servicing of your fuel or tank that you may have had done. Now, servicing here can mean anything from fuel filtration, fuel polishing, some people call it that, to just simply inspection of the fuel or testing of the fuel by some kind of qualified third-party provider. The key consideration here isn't exactly what they did, but just whether they examined it. Again, relates to what we said earlier. We're interested in how close you're paying attention, and simply paying closer attention to your stored fuel in your storage tanks makes it more likely that you're going to have healthier stored fuel in the long run. And having your tank or fuel service isn't something that everyone does, because it is kind of an extra step, but it is a significant plus factor for maintaining, good stored fuel health. So if you have had that done in the last 6 months, it's going to make it much more likely that your stored fuel's health is going to be, shall we say, satisfactory. So you've answered the 12 questions. And your answers, as you were putting them in, your answers were assigned internal point values in accordance with what we know about their relationship to stored fuel health. So once you're done, what comes up next is a page that looks like this. It's a results page. Now, there's several things on here that you're going to want to notice. Now, on the left-hand side here, that's your score, your total score. Your fuel health score. In this case, all the answers that I put in, the fuel health score for me was 29, and it's on a scale of 0 to 29, so I got the highest possible. Now, the thing to remember for the purposes of this tool, higher is bad and lower is better. So hopefully I actually don't have fuel that's as bad as all the answers I put in, because if I did, I would be in real trouble. So you see your fuel health score there. And then what you see also is that the score is assigned a color, essentially. It's either going to be red, it's going to be yellow, or it's going to be green. In this case, because it's the worst score, it qualified as red. And this color assignment is designed to give you just a very quick visual classification of whether your score is good or bad. And then along with this, there is a quick recommendation box that has recommendations based on the color score. So, for example, my fuel health score was red, pretty bad, and so what the tool tells me is your fuel's at serious risk for the kind of problems that will compromise its ability to function. Okay, then it's up to you whether you want to follow through on this, or on whatever best practices apply to your situation. Now, naturally, though, you may not, what if you don't know what those best practices are? Well, if you need assistance with that, that's exactly the kind of thing that we can help with. So you have the option that if you want your results emailed to you, then you can put in your email address here and say, send me the results. And you click on it, and you get an email with your answers and your fuel's health score and the interpretation. And then the final item on the results page is an option to get more information on the things that the health check tool has been talking about. At the bottom of the page is a banner, and it says, your fuel health score, what does it mean? Now, this is an optional report that we put together, what we might call a white paper report. And it goes into more detail on each of the questions. What aspect of stored fuel health does that question pertain to? Why is it important? Maybe what's the science behind some of those things? And then most importantly for many of you, are there any best practice recommendations for some of these things that you should specifically be doing for your stored fuel? So once you've completed the tool, you have the option to get this additional white paper. All you do, you just click on the banner. Takes you to just a real simple landing page where all you have to do is put in your email address, and that report will be emailed to you. So that, my friends, is your fuel health check tool. And we created it because we wanted to give everyone out there a quick way to, shall we say, raise awareness about what might be going on with their fuel. Again, all of the questions in this tool relate to proven issues related to stored fuel health. And of course, once it's all said and done, we wanted to give ways for you to get more information if that's what you decide that you need to do. So, having reviewed all this, everyone is welcome to go give it a try and see what it says for you. Remember that it's located at bellperformance.com/fuelcheck. So what we're going to do once this webinar is over here in a few minutes is we're going to follow up with an email to everybody probably in the next day or so. The email is going to have the link in it. So feel free, if there's other people that weren't able to come, then feel free to share that with anyone that you think might find the tool useful. And then, of course, we will send out an email because we're going to put a recording of this up. So if someone at your company needed to see but couldn't come, this will be available for all of you to access. So that brings us to the end of the webinar itself. At this point, everyone is unmuted. So if there are any questions, then feel free to, you can ask them or you can type them in. So are there any questions about any of the things that we've been talking about? All right. Well, if there are no questions. Okay. I heard somebody. Well, maybe that's just the reverb on my phone. Okay. All right. Well, we are about at the end. If you do have any questions, then absolutely you can email me. You should have my email address from the registration emails that you received. So if you have any questions, if you wake up in the middle of the night with this, oh my gosh, I forgot to ask so-and-so, then send me an email. Hopefully wait till you get to work the next morning, but just email me. We'll be glad to help in whatever way, to answer your question whatever way we can. So that brings us to the end. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Appreciate it. Hope you found this useful. So everyone have a great rest of the week, and thanks for joining us.